The earth trembled beneath Captain Elena Vasquez's boots as another shell screamed overhead, its whistle cutting through the dawn like a blade through silk. She pressed her face deeper into the mud of the observation post, tasting copper and cordite on her lips, feeling the percussion waves ripple through her chest cavity like a second heartbeat. The radio crackled with desperate voices, forward observers calling for immediate suppression, medics screaming for safe passage, commanders demanding answers that didn't exist. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Counter battery radars down again, Sergeant Marcus Webb whispered beside her, his voice barely audible over the incoming fire. His weathered hands shook as he adjusted the field glasses, scanning the smoke-shrouded horizon where muzzle flashes bloomed like deadly flowers. Third time this week. Those bastards know exactly where to hit us. Elena rolled onto her side, mud caking the left side of her face like war paint. Her dark eyes, inherited from her grandmother who had survived the siege of Stalingrad, tracked the trajectory of the incoming rounds with mathematical precision. Each explosion painted shadows on her retinas, the hospital tent collapsing in a shower of canvas and screams, the supply convoy erupting in pillars of flame and twisted metal, the communications bunker simply vanishing as if it had never existed at all. "How many guns do you count?" she asked, her voice steady despite the chaos. It was a voice that had commanded respect in peacetime exercises and earned loyalty in the crucible of actual combat. Her men called it the voice, calm as still water, sharp as winter air, carrying the weight of absolute conviction. Webb squinted through the binoculars, his jaw working methodically on a piece of gum that had long since lost its flavor. At least 8, maybe 12. They're spread across that ridgeline like a goddamn constellation. Smart positioning, overlapping fields of fire, natural concealment, multiple escape routes. He paused as another salvo shrieked overhead. "They've got us zeroed in, Cap. Every time we move, they adjust. Every time we breathe, they know about it." Elena's radio operator, Private Sarah Chun, crawled up beside them, her equipment pack scraping against the wooden planks of the observation post. Chun was barely 19, fresh from artillery school, with the kind of eager competence that reminded Elena of her younger self. The girl's helmet sat slightly too large on her narrow skull, and her uniform still bore the creases of military precision despite 3 weeks in the field. "Battalion's asking for your assessment, ma'am," Chun reported, holding out the handset. Static punctuated her words, the electronic snow of jamming equipment somewhere in the enemy lines. "Colonel Morrison wants to know if we can provide effective counter-battery fire." Elena took the handset, feeling its familiar weight in her palm. The plastic was warm from Chun's grip, slick with sweat and morning condensation. She keyed the transmit button and heard the carrier wave hiss to life, carrying her voice across miles of contested ground to the command post where maps covered. Every surface and coffee had long since turned cold in forgotten mugs. "Overlord 6, this is Firebase Charlie. Assessment as follows. Enemy battery consists of at least 8 guns, probably 155 millimeters, positioned along grid reference Tango 79er. They have us bracketed and are conducting systematic interdiction of all supply routes. Request immediate counter-battery mission." The radio hissed and popped before Colonel Morrison's voice emerged from the static. Morrison was a career artillery officer, a man who had spent 30 years turning mathematics into destruction, and had never lost his appreciation for the elegant brutality of indirect fire. His voice carried the weight of command and the exhaustion of a man who had been making life and death decisions for 72 hours without sleep. "Firebase Charlie, negative on immediate counterbattery. All available assets are committed to close air support for Bravo Company. They're taking heavy casualties and need immediate assistance. Can you suppress with available assets?" Elena closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the decision settle on her shoulders like a lead blanket. Bravo Company was 300 meters forward of her position, dug into a hillside that offered little protection from indirect fire. She could hear their desperate radio traffic bleeding through on adjacent frequencies, young voices calling. For medics, sergeants organizing defensive fires, the steady professional calm of officers trying to hold their units together under impossible circumstances, but the enemy artillery was the real threat. Each minute it remained in action was another minute of systematic destruction, another series of wounds carved into their defensive positions. The math was simple and brutal. Suppress the enemy guns or watch her entire sector collapse under the weight of continuous bombardment. Overlord 6, Firebase Charlie. Negative on suppression with available assets. We need dedicated counter-battery assets or we're going to lose this entire position. Morrison's response came back harsh with static and frustration. Firebase Charlie. Work with what you have. That's an order. Out. Elena handed the radio back to Chun and rolled onto her stomach, studying the enemy positions through her own binoculars. The morning sun was climbing higher now, burning off the mist that clung to the valley floor and revealing the brutal geometry of modern warfare. Craters pockmarked the landscape like Lunar Maria, their edges sharp and fresh from the night's bombardment. Smoke drifted across the battlefield in lazy columns, carrying the acrid smell of high explosives and the sweeter, more disturbing scent of burning flesh. "Ma'am." Webb's voice carried a question he didn't quite know how to ask. He had served with Elena for 18 months, had seen her solve impossible problems with the kind of mathematical creativity that turned artillery from mere firepower into surgical precision. But this was different. This was 8 enemy guns against their single battery of 4 aging howitzers, and the math didn't work out in their favor. Elena studied the enemy positions, her mind automatically calculating ranges, angles, time of flight, probable error. The enemy guns were well positioned, scattered across nearly 2 kilometers of ridgeline with natural defilade protecting them from direct observation. Traditional counter-battery fire would require extensive adjustment. Eating up time and ammunition they couldn't afford to waste while enemy rounds continued to rain down on their positions. "Chun," she said finally, her voice carrying the quiet authority that meant she had reached a decision. "Get me a direct line to Fire Direction Center. And Webb, I need you to plot firing data for a special mission." Webb raised an eyebrow. "What kind of special mission?" Elena's smile was sharp as a bayonet edge, carrying the dangerous confidence of someone who had just figured out how to turn an impossible situation into merely improbable. "The kind they don't teach you in artillery school." She keyed her radio and spoke with the voice of absolute certainty. "Firebase Charlie Fire Direction Center, this is actual. Prepare for simultaneous time-on-target mission. I have 8 targets and I want them all dead in the same second." The radio crackled with confused responses from the Fire Direction Center. Simultaneous time-on-target missions were complex mathematical exercises requiring precise coordination between multiple gun crews. The timing had to be perfect, each round calculated to arrive at its target at exactly the same moment, denying the enemy any opportunity to take cover or return fire. "Ma'am," came the voice of Chief Warrant Officer Rodriguez from the FDC. "We've never attempted an 8-target simultaneous TOC mission with only 4 guns. The calculations alone will take—" "Already did," Elena interrupted, pulling out a battered notebook filled with her cramped handwriting. She had spent the past 3 days working the mathematics during quiet moments between bombardments, calculating firing solutions for every possible enemy position along the ridgeline. "I've got firing data for all 8 targets. Quad 2 will take targets Alpha through Delta. Quad 3 will take Echo through Hotel. Time between rounds is calculated for standard flight times with a common time on target of ... Mark ... 47 seconds from my command." The silence on. The radio stretched long enough for another enemy salvo to impact somewhere behind their positions. Elena could hear the secondary explosions as ammunition supplies cooked off, adding their own percussion to the symphony of destruction. Finally, Rodriguez's voice came back, tinged with the kind of professional respect reserved for the truly exceptional. Ma'am, those calculations ... they're beautiful. Like mathematics made deadly. But even if the math works, we're talking about precision that requires perfect coordination. One mistake in timing and the whole mission fails. Elena glanced at Webb, who was studying her notebook with the expression of a man looking at hieroglyphics. The firing data filled 17 pages, dense with calculations that accounted for everything from wind drift to the rotation of the Earth. It was the kind of mathematical tour de force that belonged in a textbook, not a muddy observation post under enemy fire. The math is good, she said simply. The question is whether we can execute it. Another salvo screamed overhead, this one closer than the last. The enemy was walking their fire systematically across the American positions, each adjustment bringing them closer to the observation post where Elena and her team crouched in there. Holes scraped from the stubborn earth. Chun looked up from her radio, her young face tight with concentration. Ma'am, I've got FDC standing by for your fire mission. All guns report ready with standard high explosive. Elena took a deep breath, tasting cordite and morning dew. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sound of helicopters medevac. Birds lifting casualties from forward positions, their rotors beating a rhythm that spoke of urgent medical necessity. The sound reminded her why she was here, why the mathematics of destruction had become her specialty, why precision in dealing death had become her calling. All stations, Firebase Charlie Actual, prepare for Mission Prometheus. 8 targets. Simultaneous time on target. This is not a drill. I repeat, this is not a drill. She opened her notebook to the first page of calculations, her finger tracing the dense columns of figures that would either save her battalion or mark her final professional act. The math was perfect, elegant in its deadly precision. Now came the harder part, turning mathematics into reality, transforming abstract calculation into concrete salvation. The enemy artillery continued its methodical destruction somewhere in the distance, unaware that Captain Elena Vasquez had just reduced them to a series of mathematical equations. And like all good equations, they were about to be solved. Elena had discovered her gift for mathematics the same way most people discover they're afraid of heights. Suddenly, completely, and with a sense of vertigo that suggested the world had fundamentally shifted beneath her feet. She was 7 years old, sitting at her grandmother's kitchen table in East Los Angeles, watching Abuela Rosa calculate grocery money with the kind of precision that came from a lifetime of making every dollar stretch until it screamed, Mira. Mia, Rosa had said, her weathered hands moving across columns of numbers written in pencil on the back of an envelope. Mathematics is not about the numbers. It's about understanding the truth hidden inside the numbers. Rosa had survived the siege of Leningrad as a child, had learned to calculate calorie consumption against time remaining until the next food shipment, had mastered the mathematics of survival when survival required precision measured in grams and minutes. She brought that same mathematical intensity to everything: grocery shopping, bill paying, planning Elena's education with the methodical thoroughness of a military campaign. Now, 23 years later, Elena found herself applying her grandmother's lessons to the mathematics of artillery fire. The truth hidden in these numbers was simpler and more brutal than grocery budgets. 8 enemy guns were systematically destroying her battalion, and she had perhaps minutes to solve the equation before the destruction became complete. She had joined the army not out of patriotic fervor or family tradition, but because a recruiting sergeant had noticed her SAT math scores and mentioned something called field artillery. The phrase had sounded clean and technical, like engineering with a practical application. She had imagined herself in a clean command center, working with computers and digital displays, applying mathematical principles to abstract problems. Reality had proven both more primitive and more visceral. Artillery, she had discovered, was mathematics written in smoke and steel, calculations that ended in explosions, geometry made manifest in the arc of projectiles against the sky. It was Rose's kitchen table mathematics scaled up to industrial proportions, with the same fundamental requirement for precision and the same unforgiving consequences for error. Her first fire mission had been during a training exercise at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. She had calculated the firing solution with textbook precision, had called the adjustments with proper radio protocol, had watched through binoculars as her rounds landed exactly where the mathematics said they should. The target, a collection of plywood structures representing an enemy command post, had vanished in a cloud of smoke and splinters. "Outstanding shooting, Lieutenant," her instructor had said, and Elena had felt a surge of professional pride that surprised her with its intensity. She had found something she was not just good at, but exceptional at. The mathematics of destruction had revealed itself to be her calling. But this morning was different from training exercises or even previous combat operations. This morning, the mathematics carried the weight of survival, not just her own, but that of every soldier in the battalion who was depending on her ability to silence the enemy guns. The abstract had become personal. The theoretical had become desperate. Webb was studying her notebook with the concentration of a man trying to decode a foreign language. "Ma'am, I've been doing artillery fire direction for 12 years, and I've never seen calculations this complex. How long did it take you to work all this out?" Elena glanced at her watch, checking the timing for the mission that would begin in less than 2 minutes. "I started working the math 3 days ago when we first identified the enemy battery positions. Every quiet moment between bombardments, I ran calculations for different scenarios. It had become a compulsion, really. While other soldiers cleaned weapons or wrote letters home or tried to catch whatever sleep they could manage between enemy barrages, Elena had filled notebook after notebook with mathematical exercises. She had calculated firing solutions for every possible enemy position along the ridgeline, had worked out timing sequences for different combinations of targets, had even computed the mathematical poetry of simultaneous time-on-target missions that existed more as intellectual exercises than practical applications. Chen was monitoring multiple radio frequencies, her young face tight with concentration as she tracked the complex coordination required for the mission. "Ma'am, all gun crews report ready. FDC is standing by for your command." Elena nodded, feeling the familiar pre-mission calm settling over her like a familiar coat. It was the same feeling she had experienced before every significant mathematical challenge, a sense of focused clarity that reduced the world to its essential components. In this case, those components were trajectories and timing, muzzle velocities and meteorological data, the fundamental physical laws that governed the flight of projectiles through space. But beneath the mathematical calm, she could feel something else, a deeper current of emotion that had nothing to do with ballistics and everything to do with the weight of command. These were her soldiers, her responsibility, her mission to accomplish or fail to accomplish. The mathematics would be perfect, as they always were. The question was whether perfect mathematics would be enough. Her radio crackled with an incoming transmission from the forward observation post. "Firebase Charlie, this is Op 7. Enemy bombardment increasing in intensity. Bravo companies requesting immediate support. They're taking heavy casualties." Elena keyed her radio, her voice carrying the calm authority that had become her trademark. "Op 7, Firebase Charlie. Acknowledge your request. Counter battery mission commencing in 30 seconds. Advise all friendly units to take cover and prepare for extended enemy silence." The last part was more hope than certainty, but it was the kind of hope that had to be communicated with absolute conviction. Leadership, she had learned, was often the art of expressing confidence in outcomes that remained mathematically uncertain. Webb was checking his watch, his weathered face set in the expression of a man who had seen enough combat to know that even perfect plans could fail in perfect ways. 15 seconds, ma'am. Elena opened her notebook to the final page of calculations, where she had written the timing sequence in red ink. 8 targets, 4 guns, precise coordination required to ensure that all rounds impacted within a window, measured in fractions of seconds. It was the most complex fire mission she had ever attempted, and possibly the most complex fire mission ever attempted by a single battery. All stations, Firebase Charlie Actual, she said into her radio. Mission. Prometheus is commencing. Execute on my mark. 5.4.3.2. Mark. The world erupted in coordinated thunder as all 4 howitzers fired simultaneously, their muzzle blasts creating a percussion wave that rattled Elena's teeth and sent a flock of ravens spiraling up from their roosts in the nearby trees. The guns reloaded with mechanical precision, crews working with the choreographed efficiency that came from endless training and desperate necessity. Round 1 away, came the report from FDC. Time to first impact, 39 seconds. Elena was already calculating the next salvo, her mind tracking multiple trajectories through space and time. The mathematics demanded that each subsequent round be fired at precisely calculated intervals, ensuring that all 8 projectiles would arrive at their targets simultaneously despite different flight times and trajectories. Gun 2, fire when ready, she commanded, watching the second hand on her watch with the intensity of someone timing a medical procedure. Gun 3, stand by. Gun 4, prepare for rapid sequence. The coordination was like conducting an orchestra, where every instrument was a weapon and every note was measured in high explosive. Each gun crew had to execute their part of the mathematical symphony with perfect timing, perfect precision, perfect understanding of how their individual actions contributed to the larger pattern. Chun was monitoring the radio frequencies with the concentration of someone trying to catch whispers in a thunderstorm. Ma'am, I'm hearing confused chatter from enemy positions. Sounds like they're trying to figure out what we're doing. Elena allowed herself a small smile. The enemy would be tracking their radar signatures, would see the complex pattern of American rounds in flight, would recognize that something unusual was happening. But by the time they understood the nature of the threat, the mathematics would have already solved their equation. All rounds in flight, reported Rodriguez from FDC, his voice tight with professional excitement. Time to simultaneous impact, 15 seconds. Elena raised her binoculars, focusing on the distant ridgeline where muzzle flashes had been blooming like deadly flowers for the past 3 hours. The enemy guns had maintained their systematic bombardment, their crews confident in their superior positioning and their ability to remain hidden from American counter-battery fire. They were about to discover the difference between confidence and mathematics. 10 seconds, Webb announced, his voice barely audible over the continued sound of American artillery firing in carefully timed sequence. Elena held her breath, watching the distant ridgeline through her binoculars. The mathematics were perfect. The timing was precise. The coordination was flawless. 8 rounds were converging on 8 targets with the inevitability of physics and the precision of perfectly applied mathematical principles. 5 seconds, Chun whispered, her young voice tight with anticipation. The ridgeline erupted in perfect synchronization. 8 explosions bloomed simultaneously along the enemy positions, their combined flash illuminating the morning sky like a photographer's strobe. The sound reached Elena's position 3 seconds later, a rolling thunderclap that spoke of mathematics made manifest, of theoretical precision transformed into practical destruction. And then, for the first time in 3 days, the world became quiet. The silence stretched across the battlefield like a held breath. broken only by the distant sound of helicopters and the crackling of fires that had been burning since before dawn. Elena kept her binoculars trained on the enemy ridgeline, watching for any sign of movement, any indication that her mathematics had failed to account for some critical variable. But the positions that had been flashing with muzzle blasts just moments before now showed only smoke and the scattered debris of destroyed artillery pieces. "Holy shit," Webb whispered, his voice carrying the kind of awe usually reserved for natural phenomena or religious experiences. "Ma'am, I think you just wrote yourself into the artillery textbooks." Shun was monitoring multiple radio frequencies, her headset crackling with traffic from forward observers and command posts across the sector. "Ma'am, I'm getting confirmations from all observation posts. Enemy artillery has ceased firing. Looks like you got them all." Elena felt a moment of professional satisfaction, the deep contentment that came from solving a complex problem with elegant precision. But the satisfaction was tempered by the knowledge that this was merely one equation in a larger mathematical system, one variable corrected in a conflict that contained thousands of unknowns and shifting parameters. Her radio crackled with an incoming transmission from battalion headquarters. "Firebase Charlie, this is Overlord 6. Confirm status of enemy battery." Elena keyed her handset, her voice carrying the calm professionalism that masked the exhaustion of 3 days under constant bombardment. "Overlord 6, Firebase Charlie, mission Prometheus complete. 8 confirmed targets destroyed. Enemy artillery has ceased effective fire. Sector is secure." Colonel Morrison's response came back with the kind of military approval that spoke of relief mixed with professional admiration. "Outstanding work, Firebase Charlie. Your counter-battery fire has saved this entire operation. Stand by for new tasking." Elena closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the moment settle into her bones. She had spent 3 days calculating the solution to what had seemed like an impossible problem, had risked her career and her unit on mathematical theory transformed into lethal practice, and it had worked. The elegant brutality of perfectly applied mathematics had silenced 8 enemy guns in a single coordinated strike. But even as she savored the moment of success, Elena could hear new sounds in the distance, the rumble of heavy vehicles, the distinctive whine of trapped vehicles moving across rough terrain, the radio chatter that indicated significant enemy movement in adjacent sectors. One problem solved. But the larger equation remained unsolved. "Ma'am," Chun said, adjusting her headset as new traffic flooded the radio frequencies. "I'm picking up reports of enemy armor movement approximately 10 kilometers north of our position. Looks like a significant formation." Webb was studying the tactical map spread across the floor of their observation post, his weathered fingers tracing routes and elevation lines with the practiced eye of someone who had spent years reading terrain, like a book written in contour lines and grid coordinates. "If they're moving armor down through the Koringal Valley, they'll hit our northern defensive positions in about 2 hours." Elena studied the map, her mind automatically shifting from the precise mathematics of artillery fire to the broader calculus of combined arms warfare. Armor presented a different kind of mathematical problem, one that required consideration of mobility, protection, firepower, and time. The elegant precision that had solved the artillery problem would not be sufficient for the more complex equation of an armored assault. Her radio crackled again, this time with a transmission from the forward air controller attached to Alpha Company. Any station, this is Falcon 27. I have eyes on enemy armor column moving south through grid, Tango 47. Count 12 main battle tanks, approximately 20 personnel carriers, multiple support vehicles. Request immediate fire support." Elena grabbed her radio, her mind already working the problem. "Falcon 27, Firebase Charlie. We can provide immediate fire support, but we'll need precise target location and current movement direction." The forward air controller's voice came back strained with the tension of someone watching a significant threat develop in real time. Firebase Charlie. Targets are moving in column formation along Highway 7. Speed approximately 15 kilometers per hour. Leading elements will reach our defensive positions in approximately 90 minutes. Elena was already calculating. Firing solutions, her mind working through the mathematics of engaging moving targets with indirect fire. It was a more complex problem than stationary artillery positions, one that required prediction of future positions, calculation of lead times, coordination with other fire support assets. But before she could respond, her radio erupted with a new voice, one she didn't recognize, speaking with the calm authority of senior command. All stations. This is Sabre 6. I am assuming tactical control of all fire support assets in Sector Bravo. All units acknowledge. Elena frowned, consulting her communications card. Sabre 6 wasn't listed in her current task organization, which meant either a communications error or the arrival of a higher headquarters she hadn't been briefed about. Either way, it represented a new variable in an already complex equation. Sabre 6 Firebase Charlie. Request authentication and current task organization. The response came back sharp with irritation. Firebase Charlie, this is Colonel James Patterson, commanding the 2nd Armored Brigade Combat Team. I am now the senior commander in this sector, and I am taking operational control of all artillery. Assets. Acknowledge immediately. Elena exchanged glances with Webb, who was shaking his head with the expression of someone who had seen this particular movie before and knew how it ended. The arrival of armor officers often meant the subordination of artillery to close support roles, the reduction of mathematically precise fire support to simple hammer-blow missions in direct support of tank movements. Sabre 6 Firebase Charlie. Acknowledges your presence in sector. Request clarification of mission assignment. Patterson's voice came back with the kind of military authority that brooked no discussion. Firebase Charlie, you will provide immediate fire support for my advance against enemy armor positions. I want preparation fires along phase line Delta, followed by rolling barrage to support my attack. Elena studied her map, locating phase line Delta and calculating the firing solutions that would be required for the mission Patterson had just described. It was a straightforward application of artillery doctrine, the kind of simple, brutal mathematics that had been refined during World War II and had changed little in the intervening decades, but something about the tactical situation didn't make mathematical sense. The enemy armor was moving in column formation along a predictable route, presenting an ideal target for precision fires that could disrupt their advance before they reached defensive positions. A rolling barrage would expend enormous quantities of ammunition while offering minimal effect against moving armored targets. Sabre 6 Firebase Charlie. Request permission to engage enemy armor column with precision fires prior to your advance. Current target array presents optimal engagement opportunity. Patterson's response came back with the impatience of someone whose tactical plan had been questioned by a subordinate. Negative, Firebase Charlie. You will execute fires as directed. I want suppressive fires on enemy defensive positions, not precision engagement of moving targets. Execute immediately. Elena felt a familiar frustration building in her chest, the same feeling she had experienced during training exercises when superior officers had overruled her. Mathematical analysis in favor of doctrine that made political sense but mathematical nonsense. The enemy armor column represented a precise problem with a precise solution, but Patterson was demanding that she apply imprecise tools to achieve imprecise effects. "Ma'am," Webb whispered, his voice carrying the caution of someone who had served long enough to understand the political mathematics of military hierarchy. "Colonel's got rank, and he's got the authority to relieve you if you don't execute his mission." Elena nodded. understanding the larger equation at work. Military effectiveness was not simply a matter of mathematical precision. It also required navigation of command relationships, political considerations, and the complex human dynamics that determined who made decisions and who executed them. But the mathematics remained stubbornly correct, regardless of command relationships. The enemy armor column was vulnerable to precision fires for approximately 20 minutes, before terrain features would provide them with natural concealment. After that window closed, they would reach defensive positions where engagement would become significantly more difficult and casualties would be significantly higher. Her radio crackled with impatience. Firebase Charlie, this is Sabre 6. I am still waiting for your acknowledgement of mission assignment. Execute preparation fires immediately. Elena keyed her handset, her voice carrying the professional calm that masked her growing concern about the tactical situation. Sabre 6, Firebase Charlie, acknowledge mission assignment. Request permission to simultaneously engage enemy armor column during preparation fires phase. Patterson's response came back sharp with authority. Negative, Firebase Charlie. You will not engage armor column. You will execute fires exactly as directed, when directed, against targets I designate. Is that understood? Elena closed her eyes, feeling the weight of command responsibility settle across her shoulders like a familiar burden. She could execute Patterson's mission exactly as directed, expending her ammunition on targets that presented minimal value while allowing a significant enemy force to reach positions where they could inflict serious casualties. Or she could apply her mathematical understanding to engage the targets that represented the greatest threat, potentially saving American lives while risking her career and her command authority. The mathematics were clear. The choice was not Sabre 6, Firebase Charlie. Mission acknowledged, standing by for target designation. But even as she spoke the words of compliance, Elena was calculating firing solutions for both missions: Patterson's preparation fires and her own assessment of tactical priorities. Mathematics, she had learned, could be applied in multiple ways simultaneously, and command authority could not change the fundamental laws of physics that governed the flight of projectiles through space. Chun was monitoring radio traffic with the intense concentration of someone trying to track multiple conversations simultaneously. "Ma'am, I'm hearing increased chatter from enemy positions. Sounds like they're coordinating some kind of major movement." Elena studied her map, tracking the various threat locations that had been identified throughout the morning. The enemy armor column was the most immediate threat, but intelligence reports indicated other enemy formations moving through adjacent sectors. The mathematical complexity was increasing exponentially: multiple variables, shifting parameters, time constraints that changed by the minute. Webb was plotting target locations with mechanical precision, his weathered hands moving across the map with the efficiency that came from years of converting theoretical coordinates into practical destruction. "Ma'am, if we execute Colonel Patterson's mission as directed, we'll expend approximately 60% of our available ammunition on targets of questionable value." Elena nodded, understanding the resource mathematics involved. Artillery ammunition was not infinite, and each round expended on low-value targets was one round unavailable for high-value engagements. The economic equation was as important as the tactical equation, and both pointed toward the same mathematical conclusion. Her radio crackled with Patterson's voice, now edged with the impatience of someone whose authority had been questioned. "Firebase Charlie, you will commence preparation fires in 5 minutes. Target coordinates to follow." Elena took a deep breath, tasting the morning air that still carried traces of cordite from her previous mission. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sound of the enemy armor column, the grinding rumble of tracks on asphalt, the diesel whine of engines under load, the radio chatter of crews coordinating their advance toward American defensive positions. The mathematics were clear. The ethical equation was equally clear. The political mathematics of military command were less clear, but equally important. Elena keyed her radio and spoke with the voice of absolute professional conviction. Sabre 6, Firebase Charlie is ready to execute Fire's mission, standing by for your command. But her other hand was already reaching for her notebook, where 17 pages of mathematical calculations waited to be applied to a different problem. Entirely, the first indication that Elena's calculations had been more than just theoretical mathematics came 12 minutes later, when Falcon 27's voice crackled across the radio with barely contained excitement. All stations, this is Falcon 27. Enemy armor column has stopped movement. I'm seeing multiple secondary explosions and vehicles abandoning formation. Say again, enemy armor is no longer advancing. Elena felt her stomach tighten as she realized what had happened. While she had been acknowledging Colonel Patterson's fire mission, her fingers had been working independently, keying the radio frequency that connected directly to her fire direction center. The same mathematical precision that had silenced 8 enemy artillery pieces had been quietly applied to a different problem entirely. Webb was staring at her with the expression of someone who had just witnessed a magic trick performed by someone who wasn't supposed to know magic. Ma'am, did you just execute fire mission on enemy armor column while simultaneously acknowledging preparation fire mission from Sabre 6? Elena finished quietly. Yeah, I did. Chun was monitoring multiple frequencies, her young face pale with the realization of what had just occurred. Ma'am, I'm getting battle damage assessment from multiple observers. Looks like you destroyed the entire enemy armor column. 12 tanks, 23 personnel carriers, multiple support vehicles. But Colonel Patterson is requesting immediate status report on preparation fires. Elena felt the familiar calm that preceded moments of absolute crisis. She had solved the tactical mathematics perfectly. The enemy armor that would have reached American defensive positions in 70 minutes no longer existed as a coherent fighting force. But in doing so, she had directly disobeyed the explicit orders of a superior officer who had assumed tactical command of her sector. The mathematics of military justice were significantly different from the mathematics of artillery fire. Her radio exploded with Patterson's voice, harsh with fury and confusion. Firebase Charlie, what the hell is going on? I'm getting reports of fires on targets I didn't authorize. Explain immediately. Elena keyed her handset, her voice carrying the calm professionalism that masked the fundamental chaos that was about to engulf her military career. Sabre 6, Firebase Charlie. I executed simultaneous fire mission on enemy armor column while maintaining readiness to execute your preparation fires. Armor column no longer presents a threat to friendly positions. The silence that followed stretched long enough for Elena to hear secondary explosions from the destroyed armor column, their ammunition supplies cooking off in rolling thunder that spoke of mathematical precision applied to lethal effect. When Patterson's voice finally came back, it carried the cold fury of absolute command authority that had been directly challenged. Firebase Charlie, you are relieved of command immediately. You will report to my command post for administrative action. Your executive officer will assume command of your unit pending investigation. Elena felt the weight of the moment settling into her bones like winter cold. She had calculated the mathematical solution to a complex tactical problem and had applied that solution despite explicit orders to do otherwise. From a tactical standpoint, her actions had been mathematically perfect. From a military discipline standpoint, her actions constituted insubordination of the highest order. Webb was shaking his head with the expression of someone watching a natural disaster unfold in slow motion. Ma'am, you just saved maybe 100 American lives, but you also just ended your career. Elena handed him her radio and began gathering her notebooks, each filled with the mathematical calculations that had become her signature approach to The brutal arithmetic of warfare. Sometimes the mathematics are more important than the politics, Sergeant. Sometimes getting the right answer matters more than following the wrong orders. Chun was still monitoring radio traffic, her headset, alive with the confused chatter of units trying to understand what had just occurred. "Ma'am, I'm hearing confirmations from multiple observation posts. Enemy armor column is completely destroyed. No effective enemy forces remain in northern sector." Elena nodded, feeling a moment of professional satisfaction despite the career ending. Consequences of her actions. The mathematics had been perfect. The execution had been flawless. The results had been exactly what her calculations had predicted. The fact that those calculations had been applied in direct violation of superior orders didn't change the fundamental correctness of the mathematical solution. Her radio crackled with a new voice, one she recognized as Major Sarah Williams, the battalion operations officer. "Firebase Charlie, this is Overlord 3. Request immediate situation report." Elena keyed the handset one last time as the commander of Firebase Charlie. "Overlord 3, Firebase Charlie. Enemy armor threat in northern sector has been eliminated. All 12 tanks and 23 personnel carriers destroyed through precision counter-battery fire. I have been relieved of command by Sabre 6 and am reporting to his command post immediately." Major Williams' response came back with the careful neutrality of someone navigating political landmines while trying to understand tactical realities. "Firebase Charlie, acknowledge your relief of command. Request detailed after-action report upon your return to battalion headquarters." Elena handed the radio to Webb, who accepted it with the reluctant gravity of someone inheriting command under impossible circumstances. "Sergeant, you're acting commander until Lieutenant Morrison arrives from headquarters. Continue standard defensive fires as needed." Webb's weathered face carried the expression of someone who had seen enough military politics to understand the larger forces at work. "Ma'am, what you did, it was the right thing, tactically, mathematically, morally. But the Army doesn't always reward people for doing the right thing." Elena shouldered her equipment pack, feeling the weight of her notebooks and calculation tools, the mathematical instruments that had become extensions of her thinking process. The mathematics don't change based on political considerations. "Sergeant, 2 + 2 = 4, regardless of who's wearing the higher rank." Chun stood at attention as Elena prepared to leave the observation post that had been her command center for the past 3 days. The young soldier's face carried the confusion of someone watching their mentor walk into what appeared to be certain professional destruction. "Ma'am, I don't understand. You saved all those lives. You solved the problem. How can they punish you for being right?" Elena paused, looking back at the observation post where she had spent 3 days calculating solutions to impossible problems. The position was marked by mud and sandbags, communication cables, and the scattered debris of sustained combat operations. But it was also marked by the mathematical precision that had silenced 8 enemy artillery pieces and destroyed an entire armor column. Chun, the military is a large organization with complex rules and established procedures. Sometimes those rules conflict with mathematical reality. When that happens, someone has to choose between following orders and following the mathematics. I chose the mathematics. She began the walk toward Colonel Patterson's command post, her boots squelching through mud that had been churned by 3 days of artillery bombardment. Behind her, Firebase Charlie continued its defensive mission under Webb's competent leadership. Ahead of her lay a confrontation with military authority that would determine whether mathematical correctness could coexist with institutional discipline. The enemy positions that had been systematically destroying American forces for 3 days now lay silent and smoking. The mathematics had been perfect. The execution had been flawless. The results had been exactly as calculated. But the human equation remained unsolved. Halfway to Patterson's command post, Elena encountered Lieutenant Colonel Morrison emerging from a communications bunker, his face drawn with the exhaustion of 72 hours without sleep. Morrison was a career artillery officer who had spent 15 years applying mathematical principles to the destruction of enemy forces, and his expression carried the professional recognition of someone who understood exactly what Elena had accomplished. "Captain Vasquez," Morrison said, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone navigating between tactical admiration and institutional requirements. "I've been monitoring your operations for the past 3 days. Your counter battery work has been ... exceptional." Elena came to attention, her voice carrying the formal precision required when addressing superior officers. "Thank you, sir. I applied standard mathematical principles to tactical problems as they developed." Morrison studied her with the expression of someone evaluating a complex equation. "Captain, what you did this morning. The simultaneous 8-target time-on-target mission, followed by precision engagement of moving armor. That wasn't standard mathematical principles. That was mathematical artistry applied to warfare." Elena felt a moment of professional pride, even as she understood that artistic mathematics might not provide adequate defense against charges of insubordination. "Sir, the problems presented mathematical solutions. I applied those solutions as efficiently as possible." Morrison nodded slowly, his weathered face carrying the weight of command decisions that balanced tactical effectiveness against institutional requirements. "Captain, I need you to understand something. What you did tactically was perfect. Your mathematics saved probably 200 American lives this morning, but what you did procedurally was insubordination of the highest order," Elena finished. "I understand, sir. I disobeyed direct orders from the sector commander. There are consequences for that regardless of tactical results." Morrison was quiet for a long moment, studying the distant smoke columns that marked the positions where Elena's calculations had been transformed into lethal reality. When he spoke again, his voice carried the complexity of someone weighing multiple variables in an equation that had no perfect solution. "Captain, I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. If you had to do it again, knowing the consequences you're about to face, would you make the same choice?" Elena considered the question, her mind automatically reviewing the mathematical variables that had led to her decision. 200 American soldiers who would return home instead of being listed as casualties. 8 enemy artillery pieces that would never again rain destruction on friendly positions. 1 armor column that would never reach defensive positions, where close combat would have claimed additional lives. The mathematics remained stubbornly consistent regardless of personal consequences. "Yes, sir, the mathematics were correct. The solution was optimal. Personal consequences don't change mathematical reality." Morrison smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth Elena had seen from him in 3 days of sustained combat operations. "Captain, that's either the answer of someone with perfect mathematical integrity or someone with a complete inability to understand institutional politics." "Probably both, sir." Morrison's expression grew serious again as he contemplated the larger equation that included not just tactical effectiveness, but also military discipline, command authority, and the complex human dynamics that determined how wars were fought and won. "Captain, I want you to know that I'm going to include a detailed analysis of your actions in my after-action report. The tactical mathematics, the innovative solutions, the life-saving results. But I'm also going to have to address the procedural violations and the command authority issues." Elena nodded, understanding the position Morrison faced. He was caught between recognition of tactical excellence and institutional requirements for military discipline. It was another complex equation with no perfect solution. "Sir, I understand your position. You have to balance multiple variables that don't always point toward the same solution." Morrison studied her with the expression of someone recognizing a kindred spirit, another officer who saw warfare as an application of mathematical principles but understood that human institutions operated according to different mathematical rules. Captain, there's something else you need to know. Colonel Patterson has requested a formal court-martial for insubordination. But there's also been a request from higher headquarters for a detailed technical analysis of your counter-battery methods. Apparently, word of your 8-target simultaneous time-on-target mission has reached some very senior artillery officers. Elena felt a moment of surprise. She had assumed that her tactical innovations would be buried along with her military career, footnotes and after-action reports that would be filed and forgotten. The possibility that her mathematical methods might have broader application hadn't occurred to her. Sir, the mathematics aren't proprietary. Any competent artillery officer could apply the same principles if they understood the underlying calculations. Morrison shook his head with the expression of someone who had spent enough time with artillery officers to understand the distribution of mathematical talent within the field. Captain, most artillery officers can execute standard fire missions competently. Very few can innovate new methods under combat pressure. What you did this morning, that's the kind of mathematical creativity that changes how wars are fought. Elena considered this, her mind automatically shifting from personal consequences to broader applications. The simultaneous time-on-target methods she had developed could be applied to any artillery unit facing similar tactical problems. The mathematical principles were scalable, adaptable to different tactical situations and different enemy threats. Sir, if the methods have broader application, I'd be happy to document the mathematical foundations for institutional use. Morrison's smile returned, carrying the professional satisfaction of someone who had just solved a complex problem. Captain, I think that's exactly what's going to happen. But first, you need to survive your meeting with Colonel Patterson. Elena nodded, understanding that the immediate equation remained unsolved. Mathematical correctness had produced tactical success, but institutional mathematics operated according to different rules with different solutions. Sir, I'm prepared to accept the consequences of my actions. The mathematics were correct regardless of personal outcomes. Morrison studied her for a long moment, his expression carrying the weight of decisions that would affect both her immediate future and the broader application of her mathematical innovations to military problems. Captain, there's one more thing. I've been authorized to offer you a choice. You can proceed to your meeting with Colonel Patterson and face whatever consequences he deems appropriate. Or you can accept immediate reassignment to the artillery school at Fort Sill, where you'll be developing mathematical methods for advanced fire direction techniques. Elena felt her world shift slightly, like the moment when a complex equation suddenly revealed its solution. The choice represented two different paths, one leading toward potential court-martial and career destruction, the other toward mathematical research and institutional innovation. Sir, what about the charges of insubordination? Morrison's expression carried the complexity of military politics balanced against tactical necessity. Captain, there are different ways to resolve institutional conflicts. Colonel Patterson wants discipline. Higher headquarters wants innovation. Sometimes those requirements can be balanced through creative assignment of personnel. Elena understood the mathematics involved. Her reassignment would remove her from Patterson's command authority while preserving her technical expertise for institutional benefit. It was an elegant solution to a complex equation involving personal consequences, institutional discipline, and military effectiveness. Sir, I accept the reassignment, but I'd like to return to Firebase Charlie long enough to ensure proper transition of my mathematical methods to Sergeant Webb. Morrison nodded, his expression carrying the professional satisfaction of someone who had successfully navigated complex institutional mathematics. Granted, Captain. You have 24 hours to complete transition of command and document your methods for institutional use. Elena felt a moment of profound relief, mixed with continued professional uncertainty. The immediate crisis had been resolved through mathematical creativity applied to institutional problems, but larger questions remained about the compatibility of mathematical precision with military hierarchy. Sir, thank you for finding a solution that preserves both institutional discipline and mathematical innovation. Morrison's expression grew thoughtful as he contemplated the broader implications of the morning's events. Captain, what happened here today, ... It's going to change how artillery officers think about complex fire missions. Your mathematical methods are going to be studied and applied across the entire artillery community. Elena considered this, her mind automatically shifting toward the educational challenge of documenting mathematical methods for institutional use. The technique she had developed through 3 days of desperate calculation would need to be formalized, systematized, transformed, from personal innovation into institutional doctrine. Sir, I'll prepare comprehensive documentation of the mathematical foundations and practical applications. The methods are scalable and adaptable to different tactical situations. Morrison smiled with the expression of someone who had just realized that tactical innovation could be preserved and expanded despite institutional complexities. Captain, I think you're going to discover that teaching mathematics can be just as satisfying as applying mathematics. As Elena walked back toward Firebase Charlie, her mind was already working on the educational equation: how to transform desperate battlefield calculations into systematic mathematical education, how to transfer intuitive understanding into documented procedures, how to ensure that future artillery officers could apply her methods without having to rediscover them under combat pressure. Behind her, the smoke columns continued to rise from positions where enemy forces had discovered the lethal precision of mathematics properly applied. Ahead of her lay the challenge of transforming battlefield innovation into institutional knowledge, ensuring that the lessons learned through desperate calculation would benefit future soldiers facing similar mathematical problems. The immediate tactical equation had been solved. The larger educational equation was just beginning. 6 months later, Elena stood before a classroom of 32 artillery officers at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, watching their faces as she worked through the mathematical foundations of simultaneous time-on-target missions. The classroom was sterile compared to the mud-filled observation post where she had first applied these calculations, but the mathematics remained exactly the same: precise, elegant, unforgiving in their demand for perfection. The key to understanding simultaneous taught missions, she said, her voice carrying the calm authority that had become her trademark, is recognizing that time becomes a controllable variable rather than a constraint. When you can calculate exact flight times for multiple projectiles across different ranges and trajectories, you can make time work for you instead of against you. Lieutenant Martinez, a young officer fresh from basic artillery training, raised his hand with the expression of someone struggling with complex mathematical concepts. Ma'am, the calculations you're showing us ... they're incredibly complex. How did you work all this out under combat conditions? Elena paused, her mind automatically returning to that muddy observation post where enemy artillery had been systematically destroying her battalion's positions. The memory carried the taste of cordite and fear, the weight of responsibility for soldiers whose lives depended on mathematical precision applied under impossible pressure. Lieutenant, desperation is a powerful motivator for mathematical creativity. When you know that hundreds of lives depend on your ability to solve a complex equation, you discover mathematical abilities you didn't know you possessed. The classroom was quiet as 32 officers contemplated the intersection of mathematical theory and life-or-death application. Most of them had experience with standard artillery procedures, but few had been forced to innovate new methods under the pressure of actual combat. Captain Jennifer Walsh, an experienced fire direction officer, studied the equations Elena had written across 3 whiteboards. Ma'am, these calculations require a level of precision that's difficult to achieve, even under ideal conditions. How do we maintain this accuracy when we're dealing with real-world variables like weather, ammunition variations, equipment limitations? Elena smiled, recognizing the question of someone who understood the gap between theoretical mathematics and practical application. Captain, that's exactly the right question. The mathematics give us the theoretical framework, but successful application requires understanding how to adjust for real-world imperfections. She moved to a fourth whiteboard and began writing a new series of equations, these ones accounting for the variables that existed in actual combat conditions. Wind drift calculations, ammunition lock variations, barrel wear compensation, meteorological adjustments. The mathematical complexity increased exponentially when theoretical perfection encountered practical reality. The key is building flexibility into your mathematical framework. You calculate the perfect solution first. Then you build in adjustment factors for the variables you can predict and rapid correction methods for the variables you can't. Lieutenant Colonel Anderson, the director of the Advanced Artillery Course, watched from the back of the classroom with the expression of someone evaluating whether theoretical innovation could be transformed into practical doctrine. Anderson was a career artillery officer who had spent 20 years applying mathematical principles to the destruction of enemy forces, and his presence in Elena's classroom indicated institutional recognition of her methods. Captain Vasquez, Anderson said, his voice carrying the weight of institutional authority, your mathematical methods are theoretically sound and have been proven effective under combat conditions. But we need to address the practical question of how to train artillery officers to apply these methods when they don't have your level of mathematical background. Elena nodded, understanding the educational challenge Anderson had identified. Her mathematical intuition had been developed through years of studying advanced mathematics, but most artillery officers had practical rather than theoretical mathematical training. Sir, that's why I've developed what I call the building block method. We start with simple two-target simultaneous missions, master the basic mathematical principles, then gradually increase complexity as officers develop confidence with the pay. Calculations. She moved to a fifth whiteboard and began outlining a progressive training curriculum that started with basic concepts and gradually built toward the kind of complex multi-target missions he had executed under combat conditions. Each level required mastery of specific mathematical skills before advancing to more complex applications. Captain Rodriguez, an instructor from the basic artillery course, studied the progression with the eye of someone who understood the challenge of teaching complex subjects to officers with varying mathematical backgrounds. Ma'am, how long does it take to develop proficiency with these methods? Elena considered the question, her mind automatically calculating learning curves and skill development timelines. For officers with strong mathematical backgrounds, basic proficiency can be achieved in about 6 weeks. For officers who need additional mathematical foundation, it takes closer to 12 weeks. But true mastery, the ability to innovate new solutions under pressure, that takes years of practice. The classroom discussion continued for another hour, with officers asking increasingly sophisticated questions about mathematical applications, practical limitations, and training requirements. Elena found herself energized by the intellectual challenge of transforming battlefield innovation into systematic education, of ensuring that future artillery officers would have access to mathematical tools she had been forced to develop under desperate circumstances. After class, Lieutenant Colonel Anderson approached her with the expression of someone who had made a significant decision. Captain, your teaching methods are as innovative as your mathematical techniques. I've been authorized to offer you a permanent assignment to the artillery school faculty. Elena felt a moment of surprise. Her reassignment to Fort Sill had originally been temporary, a solution to institutional conflict that preserved her expertise, while removing her from immediate disciplinary action. The possibility of permanent assignment represented a fundamental change in her career trajectory. Sir, I'm honored by the offer, but I need to understand what this means for my long-term professional development. Anderson's smile carried the satisfaction of someone who had just solved a complex institutional equation. Captain, it means you'll be developing the mathematical foundations for the next generation of artillery doctrine. Your methods are already being incorporated into standard operating procedures across the artillery community. Elena considered this, her mind automatically shifting toward the broader implications of systematic, mathematical education applied to military problems. The techniques she had developed through desperate, battlefield calculation could potentially benefit thousands of artillery officers, multiplying the effectiveness of American fire support across multiple theaters of operation. Sir, if my methods are being incorporated into standard doctrine, I'd like to continue developing advanced applications. There are other mathematical problems in artillery that could benefit from similar innovative approaches. Anderson nodded with the expression of someone who understood the potential for continued mathematical innovation. Captain, that's exactly what we're hoping for. We want you to establish an advanced mathematics program for artillery officers, something that goes beyond standard ballistics and gets into real mathematical creativity applied to tactical problems. Elena felt a surge of professional excitement as she contemplated the challenge of building a systematic program for mathematical innovation in military applications. It would require developing new educational methods, creating progressive curricula, identifying officers with the mathematical aptitude for advanced training. Sir, I'd like to accept that assignment, but I have one request. Anderson raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to continue. I want to maintain regular contact with operational units. Mathematical innovation requires understanding current tactical problems, and that understanding comes from exposure to real-world challenges. Anderson's smile broadened as he recognized the wisdom of Elena's request. Captain, I think that can be arranged. In fact, I think regular consultation with operational units will be a requirement of your position. That evening Elena sat in her quarters at Fort Sill, working on the comprehensive manual that would document her mathematical methods for institutional use. The book, tentatively titled Advanced Mathematical Applications in Artillery, Fire Direction, would contain 17 chapters, covering everything from basic simultaneous fire missions to complex multivariable tactical problems. As she wrote, her mind returned to that muddy observation post where she had first applied these calculations under enemy fire. The memory carried the weight of responsibility for soldiers whose lives had depended on mathematical precision. The taste of fear mixed with the satisfaction of solving impossible problems through elegant calculation. Her phone rang, interrupting her writing. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but the voice that answered was immediately familiar. Ma'am, this is Sergeant Webb. I hope you don't mind me calling. Elena felt a surge of warmth at hearing Webb's voice. Sergeant, it's good to hear from you. How are things at Firebase Charlie? Webb's voice carried the satisfaction of someone who had successfully applied new mathematical methods under operational conditions. Ma'am, we've been using your techniques for counter-battery operations across the entire sector. Last week, we silenced 12 enemy artillery pieces using a modified version of your simultaneous totes method. Elena smiled, feeling the deep satisfaction that came from knowing her mathematical innovations were continuing to save lives in operational environments. That's outstanding, Sergeant. Any modifications to the basic mathematical framework? Webb's voice carried the excitement of someone who had discovered new applications for established mathematical principles. Yes, ma'am. We figured out how to adapt your methods for engaging multiple target types simultaneously: artillery, armor, and personnel concentrations, all in the same mission. It's mathematically complex, but incredibly effective. Elena grabbed a notebook and began taking notes as Webb described the mathematical modifications his team had developed. The conversation continued for 40 minutes, covering technical details that would eventually find their way into advanced chapters of her training. Manual. After hanging up, Elena returned to her writing with renewed energy. The mathematical methods she had developed under desperate circumstances were evolving, growing, adapting to new tactical situations through the creativity of artillery officers who understood the fundamental principles and were applying them to different problems. Her manual would not be a static document, but a living foundation for continued mathematical innovation in military applications. Each chapter would provide the theoretical framework for artillery officers to develop their own creative solutions to tactical problems that didn't yet exist. As she wrote late into the night, Elena could hear the distant sound of artillery training exercises, new officers learning the basic mathematics of destruction, gradually building the skills that would eventually allow them to develop their own innovative solutions to impossible problems. The immediate tactical equation had been solved 6 months ago at a muddy observation post under enemy fire. But the larger educational equation was ongoing, growing, multiplying its effects through each officer who learned to apply mathematical creativity to military problems. Mathematics, Elena had discovered, was not just about solving individual equations but about creating frameworks for continued problem solving. The legacy of that desperate morning when she had silenced 8 enemy guns would continue expanding through each officer who learned to see warfare as an application of mathematical principles rather than simply following established procedures. The mathematics were eternal. The applications were infinite. The impact would be measured not in individual tactical successes but in the accumulated effectiveness of thousands of artillery officers who had learned to think mathematically about military problems. 3 years later, Major Elena Vasquez stood on the observation deck of the Fort Sill Museum, watching a new class of artillery officers conduct their final exercise. The students below were executing a complex 12-target, simultaneous time-on-target mission, the kind of mathematical complexity that had once existed only in her desperate battlefield calculations. The Vasquez method, as it had come to be known in artillery circles, was now standard doctrine across all American artillery units. Her mathematical innovations had been studied, refined, and systematized into training programs that produced artillery officers capable of mathematical creativity under pressure. Lieutenant General Patricia Hayes, the commanding general of the Chiva Field Artillery School, joined Elena on the observation deck. Hayes was a career artillery officer who had spent 30 years applying mathematical principles to military problems, and her presence indicated the institutional recognition Elena's work had achieved. "Major, your students are executing that mission with a precision that would have been impossible 3 years ago. The mathematical training program you've developed has fundamentally changed how we think about artillery operations." Elena watched through binoculars as 12 artillery pieces fired in perfect coordination, their rounds converging on targets spread across 15 kilometers of training range. The mathematics were beautiful in their precision calculations that accounted for wind drift, ammunition variations, barrel wear, and the rotation of the earth, all coordinated to place 12 high-explosive rounds on 12 targets within a window measured in tenths of seconds. General, the mathematics were always possible. The difference is that we now have systematic methods for teaching artillery officers to think mathematically about complex tactical problems. The explosions bloomed simultaneously across the training range, 12 perfect flowers of destruction. That spoke of mathematical precision applied to lethal effect. Elena felt the familiar satisfaction that came from watching theoretical calculations transformed into practical reality, even in the controlled environment of a training exercise. Hayes studied the training results with the expression of someone who understood the broader implications of mathematical innovation in military applications. "Major, I've been authorized to discuss your next assignment with you." There's a position available at the Pentagon Deputy Director of Artillery Innovation. You'd be responsible for developing mathematical methods for the entire artillery community. Elena considered the offer, her mind automatically calculating the broader impact of systematic, mathematical education applied across all artillery units. The position would allow her to expand her methods beyond Fort Sill, to ensure that every artillery officer in the American military had access to advanced, mathematical training. But there was another variable in her personal equation that she needed to consider. General, I'm honored by the offer, but I need to ask about continued exposure to operational environments. Mathematical innovation requires understanding current tactical problems. Hayes smiled with the expression of someone who had anticipated this concern. Major, the position includes regular consultation visits to operational units worldwide. You'd be expected to spend approximately 30% of your time with deployed artillery units, ensuring that your mathematical methods remain relevant to current tactical situations. Elena felt a surge of professional excitement as she contemplated the challenge of scaling her mathematical methods across the entire artillery community. It would require developing new training programs, creating standardized curricula, identifying officers with the mathematical aptitude for advanced education. General, I accept the position, but I have one request. Hayes raised an eyebrow, waiting for Elena to continue. I want to maintain a direct teaching role here at Fort Sill. Mathematical innovation comes from continued engagement with students who ask questions I haven't thought of. Hayes nodded with the expression of someone who understood the wisdom of maintaining connections to educational foundations. Major, I think that can be arranged. 1 week per month at Fort Sill, maintaining your advanced mathematics program. 5 years later, Colonel Elena Vasquez stood in the Pentagon briefing room, addressing a gathering of senior artillery officers from allied nations. The briefing concerned mathematical methods for coordinating fires across multiple national boundaries, a problem that required not just mathematical sophistication, but also understanding of different doctrinal approaches and equipment capabilities. The mathematical principles remain consistent regardless of national origin or equipment type, she explained, gesturing toward complex equations that covered 3 presentation screens. The challenge is developing coordination methods that account for different training standards, communication protocols, and technical capabilities. General Sir Nicholas Bradford, representing British artillery forces, studied the mathematical frameworks with the expression of someone who understood both their elegance and their complexity. Colonel, your methods require a level of mathematical sophistication that may exceed current training standards in some allied forces. Elena nodded, recognizing the challenge Bradford had identified. General, that's why we've developed a progressive training program that can be adapted to different educational backgrounds. The mathematical foundations remain the same, but the educational approach can be modified for different national requirements. The discussion continued for 2 hours, covering technical details that would eventually be incorporated into NATO artillery doctrine. Elena found herself energized by the intellectual challenge of expanding her mathematical methods beyond American forces, of creating frameworks that could integrate different national approaches to artillery operations. After the briefing, Major General Robert Chun, the Director of Artillery for the Joint Staff, approached her with the expression of someone who had just realized the broader implications of mathematical innovation in military applications. Colonel, your work has gone far beyond solving individual tactical problems. You've created a mathematical framework for thinking about military operations at the strategic level. Elena considered this, her mind automatically shifting toward the broader applications of mathematical thinking in military planning. The precision that had silenced 8 enemy artillery pieces in a muddy observation post had evolved into systematic methods for coordinating military operations across multiple theaters and national boundaries. Sir, mathematics is fundamentally about finding optimal solutions to complex problems. Military operations are complex problems. The applications are natural extensions of basic mathematical principles. 10 years later, Brigadier General Elena Vasquez returned to Firebase Charlie for the dedication of a monument honoring the soldiers who had served during the battle where her mathematical methods had first been applied under combat conditions. The observation post where she had calculated simultaneous firing solutions had been preserved as part of the memorial, complete with the original communication equipment and maps. Sergeant Major Webb, now retired but still carrying the bearing of a career soldier, met her at the monument. His weathered face carried the satisfaction of someone who had witnessed history being made through mathematical precision applied to tactical problems. General, it's strange being back here. This little mud hole where you worked your mathematical magic has become famous throughout the artillery community. Elena studied the preserved observation post, her mind automatically returning to that desperate morning when enemy artillery had been systematically destroying her battalion's positions. The mathematics she had calculated in this muddy hole had evolved into doctrine that was now taught at military academies worldwide. Sergeant Major, the mathematics were just tools. The real magic was the soldiers who trusted mathematical theory enough to apply it under combat pressure. Webb smiled with the expression of someone who understood that individual tactical innovations could have consequences far beyond their immediate application. General, your mathematics have saved thousands of lives over the past 10 years. Every artillery officer who learned your methods has carried that knowledge into combat situations. Elena nodded, feeling the weight of accumulated impact from mathematical education applied to military problems. The desperate calculations she had performed under enemy fire had multiplied through each officer who had learned to think mathematically about tactical problems. Each unit that had applied innovative solutions to impossible situations. Private Chun, now Colonel Chun and commanding her own artillery battalion, joined them at the monument. Chun's unit had just completed a training exercise using advanced mathematical methods that had evolved from Elena's original simultaneous time-on-target techniques. General, I wanted to thank you for teaching me that mathematics could be applied to military problems with precision and elegance. Your methods have been fundamental to my unit's success. Elena felt a surge of professional satisfaction as she realized the full scope of her mathematical legacy. The young soldier who had operated radios in a muddy observation post had become a battalion commander who applied advanced mathematical methods to train the next generation of artillery officers. Colonel, the mathematics belong to everyone who learns to apply them. My contribution was simply documenting methods that any competent artillery officer could develop given sufficient mathematical foundation and desperate enough circumstances. 20 years later, General Elena Vasquez stood before the Advanced Mathematics Institute at West Point, addressing a gathering of cadets who would graduate as officers, capable of applying mathematical creativity to military problems that didn't yet exist. Her hair was gray now, her face marked by 2 decades of military service, but her voice still carried the calm authority that had become her trademark. Mathematics, she told the assembled cadets, is not about memorizing formulas or executing predetermined calculations. Mathematics is about developing frameworks for solving problems that have never been solved before. She gestured toward the complex equations that covered the presentation screen's mathematical methods that had evolved from desperate battlefield calculations into systematic approaches for military innovation. 20 years ago, I found myself in a muddy observation post under enemy fire, facing a tactical problem that had no established solution. The mathematics I calculated that morning have evolved into methods used by artillery officers worldwide. But the real lesson is not about specific mathematical techniques. Cadet Martinez, a young woman whose mathematical aptitude had earned her selection for the advanced program, raised her hand. "Ma'am, what is the real lesson?" Elena smiled, recognizing in the cadet's question the same intellectual curiosity that had driven her own mathematical innovations. "The real lesson is that mathematical thinking can be applied to any complex problem, military or civilian. The frameworks you learn here will serve you throughout your careers, regardless of the specific challenges you encounter." The presentation continued for another hour, covering mathematical principles that extended far beyond artillery applications. Elena found herself discussing optimization theory, systems analysis, decision mathematics frameworks that could be applied to logistics, intelligence analysis, strategic planning, or any field that required finding optimal solutions to complex problems. After the presentation, Colonel David Park, the director of the Mathematics Institute, approached her with the expression of someone who had just realized the broader implications of systematic mathematical education. "General, your work has created something unprecedented, a systematic approach to teaching military officers to think mathematically about problems that transcend traditional disciplinary boundaries." Elena considered this, her mind automatically shifting toward the educational challenge of preparing officers for problems that couldn't be anticipated or predetermined. "Colonel, that's exactly what we need to be doing. Future military challenges will require mathematical creativity applied to situations we can't currently imagine." 30 years later, Elena Vasquez, now retired from military service but continuing her work as a professor of applied mathematics, received a phone call that would remind her why mathematical precision in military applications remained personally meaningful. "Professor Vasquez, this is Colonel Sarah Martinez, commanding the 3rd Battalion, 18th Field Artillery. I'm calling to inform you that my unit successfully applied your mathematical methods to neutralize a significant enemy threat. This morning, 0 friendly casualties, complete mission success." Elena felt a surge of deep satisfaction as she realized that mathematical methods she had developed 30 years ago in a muddy observation post continued to save lives in current combat operations. "Colonel, I'm honored that my methods continue to be useful. Can you provide details about the tactical situation?" Martinez's voice carried the excitement of someone who had just experienced the elegant power of mathematics applied to military problems. "Ma'am, we faced a complex enemy defensive system with multiple integrated threats. Using advanced applications of your simultaneous engagement methods, we neutralized 17 enemy positions in a single coordinated strike." Elena grabbed a notebook and began taking notes as Martinez described the mathematical modifications her unit had developed. The conversation continued for 30 minutes, covering technical details that represented continuing evolution of mathematical methods she had originated 3 decades earlier. After hanging up, Elena returned to her current project, a comprehensive textbook on mathematical applications in military operations that would serve as the foundation for advanced mathematical education at military academies worldwide. The book would contain 43 chapters covering everything from basic optimization theory to complex systems analysis, all illustrated with practical applications from military operations. As she wrote, her mind returned to that muddy observation post where enemy artillery had been systematically destroying her battalion's positions, where desperate necessity had forced her to calculate mathematical solutions to problems that had seemed impossible. The mathematics she had developed that morning had evolved far beyond their original application. They had become frameworks for thinking about complex problems, tools for developing innovative solutions, foundations for systematic education that prepared military officers to apply mathematical creativity to challenges that couldn't be anticipated. 40 years later, the Elena Vasquez Center for Mathematical Innovation at Fort SIL graduated its 10,000 student officers who carried advanced mathematical training into military assignments worldwide. Elena, now 84 years old, but still sharp with the mathematical clarity that had defined her career, spoke at the graduation ceremony. Mathematics, she told the assembled graduates, is ultimately about finding truth hidden within complexity. Military operations are complex systems with multiple variables and uncertain outcomes. Mathematical thinking provides frameworks for understanding those systems and developing optimal solutions. She paused, looking out at faces that represented the next generation of military officers who would apply mathematical methods to problems that didn't yet exist. 40 years ago, I found myself in circumstances that required mathematical innovation under pressure. The specific techniques I developed that day are now part of standard military doctrine. But the real legacy is not those specific techniques, it's the systematic approach to mathematical thinking that you carry forward into your careers. The graduation ceremony continued with recognition of outstanding mathematical achievement, presentations of advanced research projects, and commissioning of new officers who would carry mathematical innovation into operational environments worldwide. After the ceremony, Elena walked through the halls of the center that bore her name, studying displays that chronicled the evolution of mathematical methods in military applications. The progression was clear, from desperate battlefield calculations to systematic, educational programs that produced officers capable of mathematical creativity under pressure. That evening, alone in her study, Elena opened a worn notebook that contained her original calculations from that muddy observation post 4 decades earlier. The handwriting was cramped and urgent, the mathematics worked out under enemy fire by someone who understood that lives depended on precision applied under impossible circumstances. The calculations remained mathematically perfect, elegant solutions to complex problems, theories transformed into practical applications that had saved lives and changed how military operations were conducted. Elena closed the notebook and looked out her window toward the artillery ranges where new officers were learning mathematical methods that had evolved from her desperate calculations. The sound of distant artillery fire carried across the night air, not the chaotic destruction of enemy bombardment, but the precise application of mathematical principles to controlled training exercises. Somewhere in the world, artillery officers were applying mathematical methods she had originated, solving tactical problems with precision that saved lives and achieved mission objectives through elegant calculation rather than brute force. Elena smiled, feeling the deep satisfaction that came from understanding the true scope of mathematical impact. A single desperate morning in a muddy observation post had evolved into systematic frameworks that would continue benefiting military operations for generations to come. The mathematics were eternal, the applications were infinite. The legacy was measured not in individual tactical successes, but in the accumulated wisdom of thousands of officers who had learned to see complex problems as mathematical equations waiting to be solved. Outside her window, the artillery ranges fell silent as training exercises concluded for the day. But somewhere else in the world, in circumstances she couldn't imagine, facing problems she couldn't anticipate, military officers were applying mathematical thinking to impossible situations and discovering that mathematical precision could transform chaos into order, uncertainty into clarity, and desperate tactical problems into elegant solutions. The equation that had begun with 8 enemy artillery pieces silenced through simultaneous time-on-target fire had evolved into something far greater, a systematic approach to mathematical innovation that would continue expanding through each officer who learned that mathematics was not about memorizing formulas, but about developing frameworks for solving problems that had never been solved before. Elena closed her eyes and remembered the taste of cordite and fear, the weight of responsibility for soldiers whose lives depended on mathematical precision. The moment when theoretical calculation became practical salvation. Those memories remained vivid despite 4 decades of accumulated experience, carrying the emotional intensity that had driven her to mathematical innovation under impossible pressure, the specific tactical situation that had required her original calculations would never be repeated. But the mathematical framework she had developed would continue adapting to new challenges, evolving through the creativity of officers who understood that warfare was ultimately about applying optimal solutions to complex problems. Mathematics, Elena had learned, was not just about individual equations, but about creating foundations for continued innovation. The legacy of that desperate morning when she had calculated firing solutions for 8 enemy guns would continue expanding through mathematical thinking applied to challenges that couldn't yet be imagined. The mathematics were perfect. The applications were unlimited. The impact would be measured in lives saved, missions accomplished, and problems solved through the elegant power of mathematical precision applied to military operations. In the morning, new students would arrive at the Elena Vasquez Center for Mathematical Innovation, ready to learn frameworks for solving problems that didn't yet exist. They would study her original calculations not as historical artifacts, but as examples of mathematical thinking applied under pressure, illustrations of how theoretical precision could be transformed into practical solutions. The cycle would continue: mathematical education producing officers capable of innovation, innovation producing new mathematical methods, new methods enabling solutions to increasingly complex problems. Elena's legacy lived not in specific techniques, but in the systematic approach to mathematical thinking that would continue evolving through each generation of military officers who learned to see complexity as opportunity for mathematical creativity. She opened her notebook one final time, studying the calculations that had changed her life and influenced military operations worldwide. The mathematics remained as elegant and precise as they had been 40 years ago, proof that mathematical truth transcended time and circumstance. Elena wrote a final entry in the margin of the page. Mathematics applied with precision and courage can transform impossible situations into elegant solutions. The specific equations matter less than the mathematical thinking that produces them. May future officers find in these calculations not answers to copy, but frameworks for creating their own solutions to problems we cannot yet imagine. She closed the notebook and placed it carefully in the archive where it would be preserved for future students studying the origins of advanced mathematical methods in military applications. Tomorrow, new officers would begin learning mathematical frameworks that traced their origins to desperate calculations performed under enemy fire in a muddy observation post. The mathematics would continue. The applications would expand. The legacy would grow through each officer who learned that complex problems yielded to systematic mathematical analysis, that impossible tactical situations could be solved through elegant calculation, and that mathematical precision applied with courage could save lives and change outcomes. Elena Vasquez had discovered her mathematical gift at her grandmother's kitchen table, calculating grocery budgets with precision that spoke of survival under desperate circumstances. She had applied that gift to military problems with results that had evolved into systematic educational programs, benefiting military operations worldwide. The specific tactical situation that had driven her to mathematical innovation was history. But the mathematical framework she had developed continued evolving, adapting, expanding through the creativity of officers who understood that mathematics was ultimately about finding optimal solutions to complex problems. The mathematics were eternal. The applications were infinite. The legacy would be measured not in individual achievements, but in the accumulated effectiveness of mathematical thinking, applied to military challenges across generations of officers who had learned to transform theoretical precision into practical salvation.